The deafening wail of sirens shattered the quiet suburban night as firefighter Jake Reynolds slammed his foot on the gas, his pulse pounding as he read the emergency alert on his radio. Smoke was already visible in the distance, curling into the sky like a dark omen. Someone's house was burning and every second mattered. But as he sped into the gated community of Maplewood Estates, his gut told him this night would be worse than usual. Not because of the fire he had seen worse. No, it was because of something far more absurd. The moment Jake brought his fire truck to a screeching halt in front of the burning home, chaos erupted. Flames licked at the edges of the roof while desperate neighbors stood outside, their faces painted with helpless horror. He barely had time to grab his gear before sprinting toward the blaze. That was when he heard a voice, sharp, shrill, and utterly misplaced in the emergency unfolding around him. "Excuse me. Excuse me. You can't park here." Jake barely glanced up as he yanked open the fire hydrant, rushing to connect the hose. But the voice persisted, cutting through the sirens, the crackling flames, and the shouting of his fellow firefighters. "This is a no parking zone. You are in direct violation of HOA regulations." Through the haze of smoke and urgency, Jake turned and saw her. Karen Kingston, the self-proclaimed queen of the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. Dressed in an immaculate beige pantsuit, clutching a clipboard like it was a badge of honor, she stood there with her hands on her hips, utterly oblivious to the fact that lives were at stake. Jake didn't have time for this. He turned back to his team, barking orders, his mind focused on the burning house. But Karen was relentless. She pulled out her phone and snapped pictures of his truck. "You are blocking emergency access," she huffed. Jake whipped around, dumbfounded. "I am the emergency access." Karen's lips pursed into a thin line. "That is not an excuse to ignore community guidelines. That truck is a commercial vehicle. Section 12B strictly prohibits overnight parking of any." Before she could finish her sentence, the front windows of the burning house exploded outward in a violent burst of heat. The crowd screamed. Jake grabbed his radio, signaling his crew to move fast. In the chaos, Karen took a dramatic step backward, clutching her chest as if she had just witnessed something personally offensive. But even as embers rained onto the pavement, she didn't stop. Jake charged toward the front door, his boots pounding against the pavement as he mentally calculated the time left before the structure became completely unsalvageable. His team was already working their way through the side entrance, but someone was still inside. An elderly woman, according to the frantic neighbor who had called 911. With a deep breath, he pushed through the doorway, instantly engulfed in thick, blinding smoke. Visibility dropped to near zero as heat wrapped around him like an unbearable weight. The air crackled, groaned, threatened to collapse at any moment. Coughing against the stifling smoke, he pressed forward, sweeping through the living room before spotting a figure slumped near the staircase. The woman was barely conscious, her frail frame struggling against the toxic air. Jake scooped her up without hesitation, muscles burning as he carried her toward safety. His lungs screamed for fresh air, but he pushed forward, each step a battle against the flames that clawed at his back. The second he burst through the doorway, the structure behind him caved in with a sickening roar. The crowd erupted into cheers. The woman gasped for air, eyes fluttering open as paramedics rushed to take her from his arms. His heart hammered in his chest, a mixture of relief and exhaustion threatening to pull him under. And then, well, this is completely unacceptable. Jake turned, wiping soot from his eyes just in time to see Karen waving a pink slip of paper at him like it was a sacred document. "You're being fined for improper parking." Silence. The insanity of the moment hit Jake like a brick wall. His uniform was soaked with sweat. His lungs were scorched from inhaling smoke. He had just dragged a woman out of a burning building. And yet, in Karen's mind, his greatest offense that night was where he had parked his fire truck. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You can't be serious." "I absolutely am," Karen sniffed. "I have photographic evidence and HOA regulations are non-negotiable. Fire truck or not, it was illegally parked." Jake stared at her, his exhaustion replaced by sheer disbelief. He half expected someone to jump out and tell him this was a joke. But Karen stood firm, chin high, as if she had single-handedly upheld the law of the land. The tow truck arrived moments later. "Yes, a tow truck." Called by Karen. "Ma'am," one of the paramedics tried to interject, "this man just saved a life." And I appreciate his service, Karen said, placing a hand over her heart in mock sincerity. But rules exist for a reason. Jake took a step closer, towering over her, every bit the soot-covered, smoke-stained hero she refused to acknowledge. Let me get this straight, he said, voice dangerously calm. You'd rather let someone's house burn down than have a fire truck parked in the wrong spot? Karen blinked. I don't make the rules, Mr. Reynolds. I simply enforce them. For the first time in his career, Jake was at a complete loss for words. The absurdity of the situation was almost laughable. Almost. By the time he finally got home, exhaustion slammed into him like a freight train. He peeled off his gear, collapsed onto his couch and let out a long breath. He had saved a life. That should have been the end of it. But fate, or rather Karen Kingston, had other plans. Because sitting there on his doorstep was an envelope. Jake ripped it open. Final notice of violation. $500 fine. Due immediately. His hands tightened around the paper. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jake sat at his kitchen table, the fine notice crumpled in his fist. He had seen his fair share of absurd situations, but this was something else entirely. His entire career revolved around saving lives, yet here he was, being punished for doing exactly that. A mixture of exhaustion and frustration simmered in his chest, but more than anything, there was an undeniable feeling that this was far from over. Karen Kingston had made it personal, and if she thought he was going to roll over and take it, she had another thing coming. The next morning, Jake marched down to the Maplewood Estates HOA office, his boots thudding heavily against the polished tile floor. The place was eerily pristine, with cream-colored walls lined with framed certificates, each one boasting some bureaucratic nonsense about community excellence. At the center of it all sat Karen, behind a massive desk that seemed far too grand for an HOA office. She sipped on a cup of herbal tea, her expression placid, as if she hadn't tried to fine a firefighter for doing his job less than 24 hours ago. "Ah, Mr. Reynolds," she said with a tight smile, setting her cup down with an unnecessary amount of delicacy. "Here to pay your fine, I assume?" Jake placed both hands on the desk and leaned forward. "I'm here to tell you to take this ridiculous fine and shove it." Karen gasped as if he had just spoken the most offensive words ever uttered in the English language. "Excuse me? That kind of language is completely inappropriate in a professional setting." "Professional?" Jake scoffed, shaking his head. "You tried to tow a fire truck in the middle of an emergency. You care more about an imaginary parking violation than you do about people's lives. Do you hear yourself?" Karen folded her hands neatly in front of her, her expression unmoving. "Firefighter or not, you parked in a restricted zone. Rules exist for a reason. If we let one person break them, it's chaos." "Chaos?" Jake repeated, his voice rising. "The only chaos that night was a house burning down while you were busy writing tickets." Karen pursed her lips before reaching into a drawer and pulling out a thick binder. She flipped it open with the enthusiasm of a librarian about to recite the Dewey Decimal System. According to subsection 12, paragraph 6 of the Maplewood Estates parking regulations, commercial and emergency vehicles must obtain prior written authorization before parking overnight. Jake stared at her, baffled. Prior written authorization? So what, next time I respond to a fire, I should swing by your office first to get a permission slip? Karen didn't even flinch. That would be the proper procedure. Jake let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Unbelievable. A few other HOA members had gathered by the office entrance, whispering among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable, clearly aware of how ridiculous the situation had become. One of them, an older man in a polo shirt, cleared his throat. "Karen, maybe we should reconsider this. After all, he was responding to an emergency." Karen shot him a glare so sharp it could have cut through steel. "If we let emotions dictate our decisions, then we might as well throw out the entire HOA rulebook." Jake saw exactly where this was going. She wasn't going to budge. This wasn't about the fine anymore. It wasn't even about the parking rule. It was about control. Karen had built an entire identity around wielding power over this community, and he had challenged that. He had embarrassed her in front of the very people she expected to obey her without question. But if she thought he was going to back down, she had underestimated him. Word of the absurd fine spread quickly throughout the neighborhood, sparking debates at every corner. Some neighbors were horrified by Karen's actions, rallying behind Jake with outrage, while others, mainly those who feared crossing Karen, stayed silent, whispering behind closed doors. It didn't take long for the local news to catch wind of the story. Jake wasn't one for drama, but when a reporter showed up at his doorstep asking about the fine, he didn't hold back. He told them everything. How he had been responding to a fire, how Karen had tried to tow his truck, how she had prioritized rules over basic human decency. The reporter's eyes practically lit up as he spoke. A story like this. It was gold. The next morning, Karen's name was plastered all over the news. HOA fines hero firefighter for saving a life. Outrage in Maplewood Estates. Firefighter targeted by HOA. The neighborhood was in an uproar. Karen, however, refused to acknowledge the backlash. She doubled down, issuing more fines against Jake. First, a noise violation. Apparently, the sound of the fire truck sirens had disturbed the peace of the community. Then a lawn infraction. According to Karen, Jake's grass was precisely 1/4 of an inch too long. And finally, the most absurd fine of all, a pet policy violation. His Dalmatian, Ember, was suddenly deemed too large for the neighborhood guidelines. Jake couldn't believe it. She wasn't just enforcing the rules anymore. She was making things up just to make his life miserable. It was war now. Determined to fight back, Jake attended the next HOA meeting, where Karen planned to formally uphold his fines. The small conference room was packed, neighbors crammed into every available seat. Some were there to support Jake. Others were simply curious to see how far Karen would take things. She sat at the head of the table, tapping her pen against a thick stack of papers. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, adjusting her reading glasses, "I believe you are here to dispute the multiple violations filed against your residence." Jake crossed his arms. "Damn right I am." Karen sighed dramatically, flipping through the pages as if she were dealing with a particularly exhausting student. "While I understand your frustration, I would remind you that rules." Jake cut her off. "Karen, let me ask you something. What do you think the purpose of an HOA is?" Karen blinked. "To maintain order and uphold the integrity of the community." "And you think fining a firefighter for saving someone's life maintains order?" Karen hesitated for the briefest moment before shaking her head. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Jake challenged, his voice carrying through the room. "Because from where I'm standing, the only thing you care about is power." A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's face twitched just slightly. For the first time, cracks were beginning to show. Before she could respond, a voice from the back of the room rang out. "Enough is enough." Everyone turned. It was an HOA board member. And he didn't look happy. Karen straightened. "Excuse me." The board member stepped forward, holding a folder. "We've been reviewing some things. And we've found some interesting information about your own violations, Karen." The entire room went dead silent. Jake arched an eyebrow. Now this was getting interesting. Karen's smug expression faltered for the first time since this ridiculous battle had begun. She sat up straighter, gripping the edges of her folder as if bracing for impact. The HOA board member, a man named Greg Simmons, stepped forward, his face unreadable but his tone sharp. He flipped open his folder and took a deep breath before speaking again. "We did some digging, Karen," Greg said, looking around the packed room. "You've been throwing the rulebook at Jake like it's the Constitution, but you seem to have ignored a few regulations yourself." A hushed murmur spread through the crowd, people shifting in their seats, eyes darting between Greg and Karen. For the first time, Karen looked nervous. "That's ridiculous," Karen scoffed, forcing a laugh. "I follow the rules to the letter." Greg didn't so much as blink. He pulled out a piece of paper, cleared his throat, and read aloud. "According to HOA bylaws, any structural additions to a property require pre-approval from the board and a permit from the county." He paused for effect before adding, "Tell me, Karen, when exactly did you submit the paperwork for the gazebo in your backyard?" A collective gasp filled the room. Jake's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this, but he wasn't about to let the moment pass. He leaned forward, arms crossed. "Wait. You mean to tell me that the same person who fined me for parking a fire truck to save a life didn't even get permission for her own backyard addition?" Karen's face twitched, her carefully maintained composure slipping ever so slightly. That is completely different," she stammered. "Oh, it gets better," Greg continued, holding up another sheet of paper. You've also been using HOA funds for, let's see, a monthly business expense, labeled as community engagement luncheons. He arched an eyebrow. Karen, these receipts are from a high-end spa. The room exploded. Laughter, gasps, murmurs, people whispering to each other in disbelief. Karen's face turned bright red as she scrambled for an explanation. That is completely out of context. Those were strategy meetings. At a spa. Jake asked, tilting his head. Did you write the bylaws in a steam room? Greg ignored Karen's protests and continued flipping through the documents. You fined residents for having fences taller than 4 feet, but yours is nearly 6. You've cited people for leaving their trash cans out too long, but I have timestamps showing yours sat outside for 3 days last month. He shook his head. And let's not forget the fact that you tried to tow an emergency vehicle in the middle of an active fire. Karen slammed her hands on the table. I will not be ambushed in my own meeting. You're not being ambushed, Greg replied evenly. You're being held accountable. Jake couldn't help but grin. This was poetic justice at its finest. The same woman who had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood with petty fines and ridiculous citations was finally facing consequences. And she was crumbling. Karen turned toward the other HOA board members, eyes wild with desperation. You're not actually going to listen to this nonsense, are you? I have dedicated years to keeping this community in order. One of the other board members, a woman named Linda, sighed and rubbed her temples. Karen, we trusted you to enforce the rules fairly. This is beyond embarrassing. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Greg cleared his throat. Effective immediately, we're voting on your removal as HOA president. All in favor. A unanimous chorus of voices responded. Aye. Karen shot up from her seat. You can't do this. We just did, Greg said, closing his folder. Your reign is over, Karen. Jake leaned back in his chair, arms folded. Wow. Democracy at its finest. Karen's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, but the neighbors she had lorded over for years were now either avoiding her gaze or nodding in satisfaction. Defeated, she grabbed her purse and stormed toward the exit. Just before she reached the door, she spun around and pointed a shaking finger at Jake. You think you've won? This isn't over. Jake chuckled. Karen, I already won when I parked that truck. With a final huff, she turned and stormed out of the meeting, her heels clicking furiously against the tile. The second she was gone, the tension in the room evaporated. Neighbors laughed, patted Jake on the back, and exchanged stories about their own run-ins with Karen's ridiculous rules. Greg turned to Jake, shaking his hand. I think I speak for everyone when I say we appreciate what you do. That fine. Consider it gone. Appreciate that, Jake said with a grin. A few days later, Jake came home to a much different atmosphere in the neighborhood. Instead of scowls and scrutinizing glances, he was met with smiles, waves, and even a few plates of homemade cookies left on his doorstep. The community felt lighter, as if an oppressive weight had been lifted. The best part? A brand new sign installed right at the entrance of the neighborhood. Emergency vehicles welcome. Jake smirked as he parked his truck in his driveway. Legally this time. A few houses down, Karen was outside trimming her hedges, grumbling under her breath. A few minutes later, an HOA inspector strolled by and measured her lawn. You're about a 1/4 inch over the limit, he said, jotting something down on his clipboard. Karen's jaw dropped. That's ridiculous. That's... She stopped mid-sentence, her face contorting with the painful realization of what was happening. Jake just shook his head, chuckling as he stepped inside his house. Justice had never tasted so sweet.